Hello and welcome to Perspectives with Neilo, the podcast where we go beyond the headlines to examine how foreign influence, economic pressure and political fear quietly shape modern democracies. I'm your host, Neil O'Sullivan. In our previous episode, Strategic Dependency, Ireland's Aughinish lesson, we examined allegations arising from an investigation by the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project that a significant share of the alumina produced at the Aughinish Alumina refinery in County Limerick is being exported to Russia, raising questions about whether the plant's output could ultimately be supporting supply chains linked to Russia's war effort in Ukraine. Aughinish Alumina is owned by Rusal, the Russian aluminium giant founded by Oleg Deripaska, a businessman who has been closely associated with Vladimir Putin and who is subject to Western sanctions. The issue has now moved firmly into the European political arena. Earlier in July, the European Parliament overwhelmingly adopted a non-binding motion calling for sanctions on the sale of alumina to Russia. And while the Irish government, which assumed the presidency of the Council of the European Union at the beginning of July, has repeatedly told Ukraine that Ireland will stand with it for as long as it takes, its handling of the Aughinish Alumina allegations has raised questions about what that commitment means in practice. A confidential report completed at the end of July, following an investigation by the Department of Enterprise, concluded that it could neither confirm nor rule out the possibility that alumina from Aughinish was ultimately being supplied into Russia's war economy. Now the issue has in effect been passed to the European Commission, which will have to decide whether alumina should be targeted in a future round of EU economic sanctions. Meanwhile, Russia's illegal war in Ukraine continues into its fifth year, with no clear end in sight. The nightly images of missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian cities are a reminder of the enormous human cost of the conflict. At the McGill Summer School in late July, I caught up with Professor Donnacha Ó Beacháin, who is Professor of Politics at the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University, and author of Unfinished Empire, Russian Imperialism in Ukraine and the Near Abroad. Professor Ó Beacháin had just returned from Ukraine, so I was particularly interested to hear what he had seen and perhaps more importantly, what he had heard from Ukrainians themselves. How are people coping after more than 4 years of full-scale war? How is Ukraine's increasingly sophisticated drone campaign changing the battlefield? And what do Ukrainians make of the Aughinish Alumina controversy in Ireland? We also discuss the changing dynamics of the war, the significance of China's support for Russia, and much more. But before we get to the interview, a quick request. If you enjoy Perspectives with Neilo and support what we're trying to do, please take a moment to hit that subscribe or follow button on your favourite podcast app. It costs nothing, but it really helps people discover the podcast. And now, on to my conversation with Professor Donnacha Ó Beacháin. So, Donnacha, thank you for taking the time to chat with me.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Great to be here. And I think we should emphasise we're in Donegal, which I'm not sure we're here most of the time, so we're
That's right.
Putting out there.
At the McGill Summer School. Yeah. So you just returned from a trip to Ukraine. And we're seeing a lot in the news lately about the success of Ukraine's drone strikes on Russia, but we're also hearing about more casualties in Ukraine as Russia seems to have stepped up its strikes against Ukraine. Did you get a perception there or a feel for how the war is going, if Ukraine think they're maybe winning or gaining ground, or if maybe the opposite is true?
Well, certainly the mood was more upbeat than when I had been there previously. I had been in Ukraine the previous summer, and there were a lot of attacks, and there was a feeling that this had descended into kind of a stalemate. Whereas I think now this year, a lot of people feel that the initiative, the momentum is more with Ukraine, and that's because of these attacks on Russia. And one of the reasons, indeed the main reason that these attacks are happening now, very highly publicized attacks on, Russian energy infrastructure, munition factories, is that the drones and weapons that the Ukrainians are using are domestically produced. whereas at the beginning of the war they were heavily dependent on the EU and the US, and those weapons, drones came with strings attached, that they couldn't be used for offensive purposes, they couldn't be used against Russia, only for defensive purposes. So that was essentially Russia fighting and Ukraine fighting with one hand behind its back, because Russia could fire missiles wherever it wanted, but Ukraine couldn't. But now that they're produced in Ukraine, we're finding that they're very effectively reducing Russia to a position where it's stopping the export of fossil fuels, which is remarkable in a country that depends so much on fossil fuels. You see long queues at petrol stations for hours, frustrated Russians at airports unable to leave to go on holidays, venting on social media. So that is there. Ukrainians are aware of that. Of course, they follow the same channels. They can communicate for the most part in a common language. So they were happy that Russians were experiencing a small degree of the inconvenience, because of course for Ukrainians it's much worse what they're experiencing, but they could see that ordinary Russians were seeing that this is not just a special military operation as the government is decreeing. This is a war, and the war with consequences, and of course it's a war of choice, a war that Putin could finish at any time. And the hope is, of course, in Ukraine is that, even in dictatorships, and I've lived in dictatorships for several years, they can't be completely unresponsive to what people on the ground are feeling. So the hope is that this increased pressure on Russia, this manifestation of the war's consequences for ordinary people, that this will have some kind of an effect ultimately on the Kremlin's decision-making calculus. In terms of the increased attacks on Ukraine, they're really ongoing. I think what happened recently in Kyiv, for example, was that the same amount of missiles and drones were being fired, but they don't have the anti-air defense systems to counter them in the way they do. And that's what Zelensky was highlighting in his recent visit to Ireland. And he does it during all his announcements, is that they need more of these. As you might have seen at the NATO summit, Trump, on his own initiative, it seems, gave Ukrainians the right to make Patriot missiles in Ukraine. But that'll be about 24 months before it's on stream, so it's not going to be a game changer in the near future. But that's the thing that they desperately need. It's not really the offensive weapons, it's the defensive weapons. So it's not that Russia's firing more, it's just that the Ukrainians have less to defend themselves against. And it's the unfortunates who just don't leave their apartment buildings. So it's because everybody, I have it on my own phone, I still didn't take it off since coming back. There's a little app that you have which alerts you when missiles are coming into Ukraine, and you get it when it's coming for all of Ukraine almost, and then as they're clearer where the missiles are going, they start not alerting some regions, and the alerts keep going for the region that the missile's heading towards. So people are well warned usually, and they have time to go underground usually if it's the metro in Kyiv, for example. And those who are unfortunately killed, it's usually because of the missile coming so quickly they weren't alerted, or simply they're just tired of getting out of bed every single night and making their way to the metro and said, statistically it's unlikely to be my apartment block, but unfortunately that night it happened to be that apartment block. But the main casualty levels, we tend to focus on the civilians for obvious reasons. We are civilians, and there were some terrible hits on Kyiv a week or two ago when I think in 2 strikes about 60 people were killed. But the vast majority of people being killed are on the front line, and they're not even being killed by human beings. I mean, in a sense, it's not direct combat. This is the killing zone. And it's remarkable. I've seen Ukrainians arrest Russian soldiers by drones. I mean, and sometimes they're human commanded, sometimes artificial intelligence, capture territory by the use of drones, rescue people by the use of drones. So it's a remarkable war. There's really been a transformation in how war is conducted, and the Ukrainians have led the way in this. They have this kind of cutting edge in the technology, and that's why we're seeing, I think, a very fluid situation. But it's one that Ukrainians, I cannot emphasize enough, are, despite all that's been thrown against them, they are very resilient, and they know that,
and determined,
and as they often say, I mean, if Russia stops fighting, there'll be no war, but if Ukraine stops fighting, there'll be no Ukraine. So they don't feel they have any option but to defend themselves. Zelensky said over a year ago that Ukraine is willing right now to have a ceasefire and negotiate. It's Russia that persists with its maximalist demands and says they want to fight on for more.
Yeah, and you spoke about casualties there on the front line also. That aren't even person-to-person casualties. It's by drone. We do see some reports online, maybe unconfirmed, that Russian casualties are heading into daily numbers of 1,500 was one report I saw, but that overall Russian casualties in the war are hundreds of thousands. It seems like Russia is in a bit of a dire situation when it comes to the front line.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, the figures that regularly are turned out, and there's reasonable consensus around, are about 30 to 35,000 they're losing a month. And for the totality of the war, we're talking something in the region of 1.2, 1.3, maybe 1.4 million. It's not known exactly. The Ukrainians have lost substantially less. Of course, it's far too much for Ukraine. It is an asymmetrical war. But it's nothing compared to the Russians, because the Russians, for various reasons, have a different approach to war, largely because, of course, Ukraine is a democracy. We saw only over the last week how Zelensky had to reverse track because of mobilizations of civil society. We'd never see that in Russia. So Putin is rather uninhibited, at least he feels he is, in conducting the war. And then it's in terms of the soldiers that they use. I mean, they are often conscripts. They are often people from ethnic minorities throughout Russia. We always forget, as we did during the Cold War. During the Cold War, we thought of the Soviet Union as Russia. They were synonymous. Now today we talk about the Russian Federation as synonymous with Russia, when of course it's made up of many different nations. One nation, for example, the Buryats, who live in Buryatia. I spent 3 summers and a winter there, and they're about as far from the front line as you can get. But if you're from Buryatia, you're 100 times more likely per capita to die fighting in Ukraine than if you're from Moscow. So they're bringing up these ethnic minorities. There's 10 million Central Asians officially living in Russia. Unofficially, there's far more. Now, I lived in Central Asia for 6 years, so it's a topic that I'm quite intimate with, and they are economic migrants. But since the full-scale invasion, their citizenship applications have been speeded up, and then, of course, once they get the citizenship, they're told their first duty of citizenship is to fight for your country in Ukraine. So they're pushing a lot of Central Asians by fair means and foul. Sometimes actually what they do is they arrest people on spurious, trumped-up charges, and they say, you're going to prison now for 5 years, or you could go out and if you fight for Ukraine in 6 months, everything will be forgotten, and some people will take up that offer. Sometimes they offer eye-watering sums of money. They say, of course they know they're hardly going to likely to live for the 6 months. So there's a whole range of things. They're often also recruiting people from other countries like Kenya, from Peru, from Cuba, and again often on grounds that you'll get a job working in a hospital or in the canteen alongside the army, and then when they go, their passport is taken and they're thrown into battle as well. So they have, and of course Prigozhin led the way in this. They emptied the prisons. They offered everybody, a deal, a Faustian pact, that if they could fight and survive for 6 months in Ukraine, they get an amnesty. And obviously, the more serious your crime, the more tantalizing that offer is. So, murderers, rapists, all were thrown into the battle. Some survived and then were just sent back to their villages and often committed crimes again and were offered the same deal again: go to Ukraine, fight 6 months. So that's a long way of saying that they've still managed to insulate a lot of Russians living, the kind of the cappuccino-sipping white Slav living in Moscow and St. Petersburg. They still, that's why these attacks on the refineries had such a psychological impact. They hadn't really felt the results of the war. If you were from a small village in Tuva, another place like Buryatia, or even from Chechnya, you were aware that a lot of your compatriots were dying and coming back in coffins, but not if you were from Moscow or St. Petersburg. So that kind of colonial dynamic, which is often forgotten, that internal colonialism is one of the factors that allows Russia to supply the line. But it's not sustainable. I mean, I spent quite a bit of time in Georgia and in Kazakhstan, where a lot of Russians fled after the first mobilization call, and they were exactly the kind of people I'm talking about. They were white, they were from the large cities, and they were afraid that they were going to be next. And Putin is trying to hold back from another mobilization call because he knows that will lead to another outflow of people, and they're the people he doesn't want to lose because they're usually educated, they have resources, they're not a drain on the societies in Georgia and Kazakhstan. They bring money with them, they buy apartments, but they don't want to die in a war, and you know what a dictatorship is like. I mean, it's people are they're waiting this out. I mean, they don't want to they don't want to take a stand on it, either to oppose the government or to participate in the war. So if they feel they're close to fighting in Ukraine, they'll leave.
Mm-hmm. What about desertion? If a lot of people are being coerced to fight, desertion must be a problem also. There are, again, unconfirmed online reports that there are special forces to go after the deserters. Do we know anything about that?
Desertion is always a challenge, but they have. I mean, it's a rather brutal regime, and they do keep people in line. And this is a long tradition going back even to the Second World War, where you might remember the stories of how when the Soviet troops, which were of course often largely Russian, were being pushed forward, they had of course to face the fire of the enemy, but they had their own people behind who were ready to shoot them if they tried to retreat. So it's very hard to, once you're enlisted and once you're sent far away, it's very hard to escape. So, there are, of course, efforts to leave, but most of them are preemptive, as I said. Most of them are people trying to leave before they get to the situation where they're conscripted and thrown into battle.
So to get back to Ukraine and your visit, and we talked about Ukraine's drone program. Did you get any insights there into how this is so successful in such a short time? Because, within 4 years or less, Ukraine has ramped up this drone program and, to incredible success in terms of pursuing this war, right?
Well, it is a remarkable achievement, and it says a lot about the innovation of the Ukrainian people that during a war they can, produce so many new aspects which have transformed the war in their favor, despite the asymmetry. Despite the odds being against them. I mean, Russia's population at the end of the day is still 4 times that of Ukraine. The territory is far larger. But the technological edge in many respects has moved in recent times towards Ukraine. Some of that is put at the doorstep of Mikhailo Fedorov, of course, who was until recently the Minister of Defense, only 35 years of age, had been Minister for Digital Transformation beforehand. And when he was Minister for Digital Transformation, he brought in a wonderful app which really brought the state into your smartphone. You could do your passport application, your driving license, your housing registration. You could even get married and divorced online through this app. So essentially everything, all interactions with the state were through this app. So and this went, you have to remember that this is a society that was only 3.5 decades ago part of the Soviet Union, very bureaucratized, very slow. But someone like Fedorov was born in 1991. I mean, he's as old as the state. So they are tech savvy. They look for innovative ways. And that's why, if we move on to that kind of clash that occurred recently with the Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi, who's of an older vintage, he's Soviet trained. One of the reasons why Fedorov was so popular was that it was felt that his attitude was, we can afford to lose drones, but we can't afford to lose people. We want to fight this war technologically because we don't have the manpower to win Russia at that particular game. If it's man against man, the Russians will always win. So we have to be smarter. We have to use technology, and drones are the future. And if you want to see the origins of where drones first came on the scene and were noticed by countries like Russia as well, of course, like Ukraine. Of course, Russia was getting their drones from Iran, the Shahed drones initially. Ukraine was getting some via Turkey. And Turkey had proved actually a real innovator in this, the Bayraktar drones, which were used in Nagorno-Karabakh. You might remember that war which broke out in 2020 during COVID. And that had been a frozen conflict. Yeah. Armenian forces had defeated Azerbaijanis in the early 90s, and they had captured this territory, which was Armenian populated Karabakh, but they'd captured also the areas around it. And in 44 days, Azerbaijan completely annihilated the Armenian forces. And they did that because the Armenians were still using Soviet-era technology and methods. And the Azerbaijanis benefited from Turkey being a NATO member and having those drones. And it was an amazing aspect to watch, because we never thought, firstly, that it would happen in such a demonstrative and effective way. So everybody was looking at that and learning from that, and the Ukrainians seem to have learned the most from it, and they brought it several steps forward since then.
Yeah, it's also interesting to me that I recently read that Ukraine has succeeded in developing its own domestic drone development program, which is independent of Chinese parts. And I suppose that's interesting insofar as we hear about this China shock 2.0, discussions about China here at McGill and so on, and how Europe is really fighting to resolve its trade situation and its dependence on China, as China floods our market with so much cheap goods. But Ukraine, who are fighting for their lives, can develop independence in their supply chain, at least in this supply chain, in the middle of a war. But it must be a good thing for them to have. I'm sure they're still using Chinese parts in their drones, but it surely must be a good thing for them to be able to develop this independence in such a key component.
Absolutely, especially since China has been supporting Russia in many ways during this war, diplomatically, militarily, economically, of course. And this is also emblematic of Europe's dilemma, because I'm not the first to observe that Europe has had three simultaneous dependencies over the last couple of decades. They've relied on cheap security from the United States, which of course Trump is withdrawing. They've relied on cheap energy from Russia, which the EU is withdrawing from because of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That was a dependence that Russia built up deliberately, hoping that the EU would not react to Russia's full-scale invasion when it came. They saw what have happened after, of course, the annexation of Crimea. After that, Nord Stream was built, Nord Stream 2. So we were deepening our dependence in Europe on Russian energy at the very time that it was having its expansionist plans. And the third dependency, of course, was on cheap goods from China. So Europe has tried to make itself more resilient, more independent, but it's a challenge to try and wean ourselves off those three dependencies simultaneously at the same time. But the Ukrainians, again, they are facing choices which fortunately we haven't to face yet. And that's why they've had to think outside the box and find ways of getting, they don't get their energy from Russia, of course. The Americans are not coming to their aid. In fact, they're not really helping much at all. And of course, as you say, China is in the mix as well. So no, it is a big achievement, and it's one that Europe could try and follow in many other respects, because it's not healthy to have such a dependency.
To go back to the gentleman you mentioned there, their Minister, or at least for Defence, Mikhailo Fedorov, and his sacking. There were protests in Ukraine at that news, right? And I believe in the interim, President Zelensky has offered him other positions, one being Vice Prime Minister, but he's turned them all down.
Yeah.
This can't be good news for their drone program then going forward.
Well, Fedorov's point of view is that there's only three positions that can really influence the course of the war for Ukraine. That's the President of Ukraine, which of course there's no vacancy there, the Commander-in-Chief, which of course is led by a military man, and Fedorov is not a military man, or the Minister of Defence, which of course is a civilian position. So his attitude is that it's Minister of Defence or nothing. So any other position isn't constitutionally grounded, isn't legally based, so he doesn't really have a mandate to do the kind of reforms that he was implementing in the army. And they were on multiple levels. It wasn't just about drone production and technology. It was also rooting out any corruption there. That's always been a problem in the region. Of course, it's a much bigger problem in Russia, but it's throughout the area. And as I said, preserving lives. Like that kind of new way of thinking of using drones instead of people. So there was a fundamental clash between ways of conducting the war and of personalities and of generations. As I mentioned, Syrskyi being in his 60s and Fedorov being only 35. And Zelensky found himself in that position of having to choose. And for reasons which he never fully articulated, he just simply said they couldn't stay in the same room together without him, which was, he had to reassert, I guess, his presidential authority, but he chose Syrskyi. But this is the one, major aspect, and of course the core difference between Ukraine and Russia, Russia being a dictatorship and Ukraine being a democracy, is that not for the first time civil society mobilized itself, and has done that at so many pivotal moments in history. You go back to the Granite Revolution in 1990, 1991, which brought about the end of the Soviet Union. We forget now that George Bush Sr. went to Kyiv in August 1991 and gave his famous Chicken Kyiv speech. I don't know whether you've ever heard of it.
No, I haven't heard
No, he spoke to the Ukrainian Rada, the parliament, and he accused them of suicidal nationalism. And he essentially said, don't leave the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's a great guy. Stick with him. And the Ukrainians didn't listen, and they went and have an independent state. But then afterwards, of course, everybody claimed to be supportive of the breakup of the Soviet Union and the independent new states. But at the time, no, the position of most Western countries was breaking up the Soviet Union was unpredictable, and they had nuclear weapons. You hear the same about Russia breaking up today into constituent parts. So best to persuade the Ukrainians and the Lithuanians and the Georgians to stay. So the one in 1991, then of course you had the Orange Revolution when there was electoral interference and trying to rig the elections in favour of Viktor Yanukovych. Then, of course, you had the Revolution of Dignity, Euromaidan, in 2013, when Yanukovych tried to pull Ukraine away from that agreement with the European Union on free trade. And then under Zelensky, Zelensky himself, when he was elected, was the most popular president in Ukrainian history. He got more than 70% of the vote. It was unprecedented. But by the time the full-scale invasion broke out, his support rating had dropped to about a quarter, about 25%. Now, of course, staying in Ukraine, fighting in Ukraine, his wartime leadership meant that he's consistently enjoyed majority support since the full-scale invasion. But it's not unlimited power, even in wartime, even under martial law. And when he sees people on the streets mobilizing, he can't ignore them as Putin can. And it's interesting to compare that the only civil society mobilization of any sort, if you can call it that, in Russia that we've seen since the full-scale invasion is Prigozhin. Remember Prigozhin's rebellion in 2023, that one day in June 23rd, when the leader of Wagner marched 800 kilometers towards Moscow. But there was no resistance, and that's the interesting thing about a dictatorship. Nobody was coming forward and saying, we support the government, we support the regime. The entire nation was sitting on the couch waiting to see who would take over and govern them. So the people in Russia don't feel they have any participation in the system, whereas Ukraine, they do.
And speaking of Russian support, though, and you kind of mentioned it earlier, the only country, it seems to me, that's actually supporting Russia is China. And we've heard various things about China's support for Russia. China buys Russian oil. We've heard they're a supplier of dual-use items. I think one of the more recent pieces of news we heard was that they've been training Russian soldiers on drone warfare in China. But of course, one of the most striking statements came around this time last year when EU Foreign Minister Kaja Kallas met with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and he told her that China doesn't want to see Russia lose the war. So my question to you is, how significant is China's support for Russia in all of this?
Oh, it's very significant at multiple levels. I mean, the economic level is of course fundamental, not least in buying all that Russian oil that is heavily discounted. So China's getting a great deal. It's great for the Chinese economy. Russia needs to get rid of it because it's not selling it to Europe anymore. Of course, it also sells to India. India was sanctioned, of course, by Trump, but not China in buying this discounted oil. And then those sanctions were removed. Then there's the dual-use technologies. It's not just China, but China, of course, is a major facilitator in that respect. So from Chinese perspective, they argue that they're respecting the sanctions, but they're deliberately sending stuff that can have a military use. And then, of course, they're giving diplomatic cover by arguing the Russian position, parroting Kremlin talking points. And as you say, it's clear that they don't want Russia to lose, because this is all about the authoritarian brand, which also links, of course, China to a country like North Korea, which has also played a major role in the war in supplying thousands of troops to fight for the Russians. And Lavrov and has been to and Shoigu, the Minister of Defense in Russia, had been to North Korea many times. There's been meetings between Putin and Kim Jong-il. So that kind of like triumvirate in a way of China, North Korea, Russia does play a pivotal kind of cooperative role in this, which is all the more reason why democracies have to also kind of unite and support each other, because the dictatorships are doing it. It's not that they have great affection towards each other, but they realize that if Russia loses, it is a hit for the team authoritarian. So democracies also have to support one another as well.
There are some commentators, though, that speculate that there's a vassalization of Russia happening because of the amount of support coming from China. Is that exaggeration, or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Russia was the senior partner of the Soviet Union, as it was. I mean, and you go back even further to when you have Stalin and Mao, and Stalin didn't take Mao seriously at all. He thought of him as a margarine Marxist, not the real butter like the Soviet Union. And the Chinese economy was, eclipsed completely by the Soviet economy. Now, the Chinese economy is more than 10 times greater than Russia's. It's a point I often emphasize, that Russia's economy is smaller than that of Italy's. And then think of its population. Its population is substantially less than Nigeria's. It's half that of Indonesia's. And of course, most of it's concentrated in what we might call European Russia or Western Russia. Large tracts which are neighboring China are virtually underpopulated. But that's where all the resources are. That's where the uranium is, the gold, the diamonds, the fossil fuels, all in an area kind of Siberia, east of that. And the Russians are worried about that. I mean, I mentioned Buryatia, where I spent many times. I mean, they're very aware of the Chinese influence in Russia. And yes, so there is that risk. And China works in a different way, of course, than Russia. Russia is is into kind of this bold gambler move almost of annexing neighbors. Yes. China, as we've seen with Taiwan, it's kind of about strangulation, suffocation over time.
Salami slicing.
Exactly. So, Russia is aware that this is happening, but it's not happening in any bold moves. Mm-hmm. But slowly it's happening. And of course, I lived in Central Asia for several years, and it's quite clear that China is replacing Russia as the key player in Central Asia. And that's never been declared openly, but the Russians are acutely aware that only go back 20 years, Russia was the key security guarantor. And now China is openly saying, and they have these Central Asia-China summits, and China is guaranteeing the security and territorial integrity of Central Asian states. You might say, well, who are they guaranteeing it against? Only Russia. So it's implied that actually if Russia causes trouble for you, China's here for you. And China's investing now more in Central Asia. So that's at Russia's expense. And it goes even beyond that, even into the Caucasus, which is really Russia's soft underbelly. He considers it its backyard and all of that. China is making investments. So China has very astutely overtaken Russia without any even declaration that there was a competition. But the Russians are aware of it.
We couldn't talk about Ukraine without talking about Aughinish Alumina. So I was curious on your recent visit. Was there any mention, or did you get any sense of, were people aware of what's going on with Aughinish Alumina in Ireland, and what did they say to you?
People are aware of it. Of course, not everybody's aware of it because people focus on different aspects and have different outlooks. But the people I spoke to were generally university educated, often professors and whatnot, and they were aware of it. That when I said I was from Ireland, they would ask me more about this issue. Of course, Zelensky has raised it, and it is a source of some sadness, I think, that Europe cannot be more united and effective on these kinds of issues, which for Ukrainians are existential. For them, this is giving Russia the means to kill Ukrainians. It's as simple as that. It's a moral issue for them and an existential one. And I guess they're saddened and confused that more people in Europe can see it in those kind of terms. Because, of course they understand that there are, as is often emphasized by local Irish politicians, there are jobs on the line and all of that. But of course there are easy counter-arguments, as I often highlight, that in countries like Australia, for example, they had the same kind of alumina plant, also Rusal, this Russian company responsible for it. But within weeks of the full-scale invasion, they had taken Rusal out of the alumina plant. They had given it new ownership, and the alumina plant stopped exporting to Russia, just found new markets. All the jobs were preserved. Apparently it's thriving. Yeah. Why we're not thinking in those terms, you know what I mean? Like, we seem to find all the reasons and excuses to say that, look, we as the report kind of came out saying, we don't have definitive evidence. It was very carefully crafted. And, they were also clear that we didn't find definitive evidence that there is alumina going to a factory that's producing weapons, but we can't exclude that possibility either. So it's almost saying it's up to you to find the evidence before we'll act. But sure, nobody has access to that information. And the Russians aren't going to provide it. And even if they did, would you believe them? I mean, a lot of what the Irish government is depending on is coming from the plant in Aughinish itself, which is Russian-owned. Yeah. Its board of directors and all that are Russian. So it is felt acutely in Ukraine that they're not getting that support. But they are aware, though, this is a long-standing trend. I mean, again, I mentioned that after the annexation of Crimea, the first invasion of Ukraine back in 2014, rather than Ukraine being supported effectively and in a united fashion by the European Union and its constituent parts, they saw essentially business as usual with Russia, particularly with Nord Stream. That was emblematic of that business as usual approach. And from their point of view, that emboldened Russia. Yeah. I mean, sanctions are supposed to deter, but actually they were so anemic, the sanctions, that they emboldened Putin to go further. And there are still states in the European Union which are buying fossil fuels from Russia. There are still countries exporting. There are still countries facilitating the Black Sea, fleet and all that.
So this report you mentioned, I mean, we're talking on July 24th. It just actually wasn't even a report. It was more like a summary document.
Yeah, because they won't release the report, they said.
So, and they're passing that now to the European Commission. And this is what we hear from the government, that the government can't decide whether or not there should be EU sanctions. Only the EU Commission can decide that. Is this just more passing the buck?
That's what it would appear like. It would appear that there isn't the will to act decisively on this. I mean, as I said, the Australians made a political decision with the same information. and they came to a radically different conclusion. The fact is that we are exporting from Aughinish far more alumina than we were at the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion. So why is Russia needing more alumina? And alumina is used, as the government argues, for civilian purposes, but it also plays a role in virtually all the critical military hardware, the drones, the helicopters, the missiles. And if Russia is needing more alumina since 2022, it seems clear that it's likely that some of that's been used for the war effort. Or if it's not, the fact that it's going to other areas is freeing up, alumina that could be used for the war effort.
You tweeted about this this morning, and there was a very interesting reply to your tweet. One person said, well, if you can't trace where the alumina is going inside Russia, why can't you trace where the stuff that's not going, the stuff that's going for legitimate uses, why can't you trace that? Which is a reasonable point, right?
No, it is a reasonable point. And even in terms of the ownership, I mean, the Swedes recently came to the conclusion that Rusal is still de facto being controlled by the sanctioned Russian oligarch, Oleg
Deripaska.
Deripaska, there we go. So it is essentially a Russian company, which is, and the Aughinish plant is an integral part of a supply chain. I mean, the bauxite is taken by Rusal, it's brought to Limerick, it's refined there, and then it's sent to the Siberian smelters where it's made into aluminum. And yes, there is a lack of will. There's no question about that to move on this.
I want to ask you if there's a lesson here for Ireland. The Aughinish story raises the question about accepting FDI, who we accept foreign direct investment from. Here we have, Rusal, as you mentioned, a Russian company. Maybe a country that has completely different values to us in how they've invaded Ukraine and so on. So, is there a lesson here for Ireland from this whole saga in terms of who we should accept foreign direct, or what kind of countries we should accept foreign direct investment from?
Oh, absolutely. But it's not just from this. We've seen, as I said, from the way that the energy dependency in particular was weaponized against us, that it's very dangerous to get into dependencies with dictatorships, with countries which don't share our values, because if we reach, an adversarial situation, those dependencies can be used against us. Unfortunately, as the United States of America becomes also authoritarianized under Donald Trump, dependencies that we had that we didn't even realize really are now being used against us. And we've seen, the way the tariffs have been used and the economic interdependency that we have is being used in a way to undermine Europe. And it's no coincidence that the United States, China, Russia, what do they have in common? They all want a weaker Europe. They want to undermine the European Union. They don't like to meet Kaja Kallas. They don't like to meet the European Union leaders because they much prefer to deal bilaterally with individual countries, because they realize, of course, that when they're dealing with individual countries, they can dominate, or they're the more powerful actor. The European Union is potentially a peer if it can act in a united fashion. So, to answer your question, yes, there is a lesson there, and there are movements to make Europe more autonomous, to make it more self-sufficient. It's a pity that it's come to this, but Europe is facing a real crossroads. I mean, this is, without being over melodramatic, it is the most important crossroads, I think, that Europe has faced since the 1930s. I mean, we've been at this crossroads before, where we've had, dictators who've wanted to unilaterally change the boundaries of Europe by force, who have a very different worldview, and who have global ambitions. And we're back to that stage again with technology added. And so Europe either, it has to make those same kinds of choices. It either has to defeat those challenges or succumb to them.
Even though they're all authoritarian, Russia and China, and, you can make your own decision, I suppose, about the current U.S. administration. But as you kind of alluded to earlier, Russia and China do work differently. And so far as maybe Russia can try and have a big hit or a big impact and maybe be more kinetic in their approach, China is a little different in how it approaches these things. How do you rank our awareness or understanding of how authoritarian regimes operate and apply coercion or apply methods to get their way in democracies? How well do you think we're informed on that in Ireland?
Oh, I don't think we're informed at all. It's part of our geographical position, we don't realize how much of an outlier we are globally. I mean, 12.5% of the world's population is a consolidated liberal democracy. We are a rather delicate flower. We're not mainstream. We forget that because we are a democracy of more than a century standing, and we're surrounded by other mature democracies. But that gives us a false sense of security. So, like, for example, when I first went to college in the 1980s, the Berlin Wall was collapsing. We had the end of the Soviet Union. We had apartheid ending in South Africa. We had Tiananmen Square. There was even hope that China was democratizing. So we had this sense that history was moving inexorably towards the democratization of autocracies. But what we've seen in recent years is unmistakably the autocratization of democracies. And even within Europe, I mean, you know, Trump is, of course, a big challenge of more recent vintage, challenging even allies like Denmark, small Denmark over Greenland. But there are lots of mini-Trumps in Europe. And we see the Trump administration and Putin and Xi reaching out to those kinds of kindred spirits in Europe. Viktor Orban was, of course, emblematic of that, and he was a friend of all three, of Trump, Putin and Xi. But there are others. You know, what would happen if we get a Le Pen victory or someone from that ilk, or Alternative for Deutschland, which is clearly the choice of the Trump administration. So Europe is not only being assailed from without, but also from within. And this is why it's a particularly dangerous and worrying period, I think, for Europe.
That's Donnacha Ó Beacháin, who is Professor of Politics at the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University. My sincere thanks to Donnacha for joining me on Perspectives with Neilo and for sharing his valuable insights. In late July, the European Union adopted its 21st package of sanctions against Russia. The package focuses on closing circumvention loopholes, restricting energy revenues, curbing Russia's financial network, and directly penalising third country actors enabling Russia's war economy. While the sanctions package did not include any export bans on alumina, it did call out 14 mainland Chinese and Hong Kong entities for directly enabling sanctions evasion or providing material support to Russian defence manufacturers. But the sanctions package also shows that the pressure on Russia and the debate over how to deal with countries and companies supporting its war economy is far from over. We've included links to additional information on this and on the topics we discussed in this episode in the Dive Deeper section of our blog. You can find that at pwneilo.com. That's pwneilo.com. And we'd love to hear your feedback on the discussion. What do you think Ireland and the EU can learn from Australia's experience with alumina exports to Russia? And does Ireland's response to the Aughinish Alumina controversy risk undermining its credibility as a supporter of Ukraine? Drop us a comment on our Perspectives with Neilo social media pages or wherever you listen to the podcast. You can also get in touch via our blog at pwneilo.com. And if you enjoyed this episode and you don't want to miss any future episodes, please hit that subscribe or follow button. It's the best way to support the podcast, and it really helps motivate us to keep producing Perspectives with Neilo. But that's where we leave it for now. Thank you for listening, and until the next time, Slán agus beannacht.